those are some things that I just wanted to comment on that the leader had to say. Finally, what I'd like to do is to put into the record, Mr. President, I'll ask unanimous consent to insert at the close of my remarks a Wall Street Journal editorial called "The Road to a Downgrade," dated July 28th.
Without objection.
Thank you. And let me quote from just a piece of this. The editorial starts by noting that the President inherited a recession and responded, I'm quoting now, by blowing up the U.S. balance sheet. Spending as a share of GDP in the last 3 years is higher than at any time since 1946. In 3 years, the debt has increased by more than $4 trillion thanks to stimulus, cash for clunkers, mortgage modification programs, 99 weeks of jobless benefits, record expansions in Medicaid, and more. The forecast is for $8 trillion to $10 trillion more in red ink through 2021. Mr. Obama hinted in a press conference earlier this month that if it weren't for Republicans, he'd want another stimulus. Wall Street Journal says, scary thought. None of this includes the Obamacare entitlement that will place 30 million more Americans on government health rolls. And then they conclude, this is the road to fiscal perdition. The looming debt downgrade only confirms what everyone knows. Congress has made so many promises to so many Americans that there is no conceivable way those promises can be kept. Tax rates might have to rise to 60, 70, even 80% to raise the revenues to finance these promises, but that would be economically ruinous. And it concludes, this instance on no reform reinforces the notion that our entitlement state is too big to afford, but also too big to change politically. This is how a AAA country becomes AA, the first step on the march to Greece. End of quotation. Charles Krauthammer, a terrific observer of the political scene, in his column Friday in the Washington Post, concluded with the following words, quote, Obama faces two massive problems, jobs and debt. They're both the result of his spectacularly failed Keynesian gamble, massive spending that left us a stagnant economy with high and chronic unemployment and a staggering debt burden. And that's the problem, Mr. President, a staggering debt burden that requires us to increase our debt ceiling, and Republicans are saying in order to stop this cycle of more promises and more spending, we've got to apply some accountability, some common sense, some good judgment. And that means, first and foremost, stop the spending. I would note, as I said before, that under President Obama, annual spending has gone up by $1.2 trillion each of the years, the deficit by $1.4 trillion. And I ask again, do you notice any correlation there? That's the problem. And I know my Democratic colleagues love to complain about President Bush, but I would note that in the year 2007, which was a year before the recession, the deficit under President Bush was just $161 billion, a tenth of what the deficit is today. So, Mr. President, my colleagues and I all need to focus on the issue before us, which is to begin to reduce spending, to insert some accountability into the process, to include some system changes so that we can't continue this unwieldy government spending that we never seem to be able to stop. And the evidence of how difficult it is the fact that for the last 4 weeks now, we've been arguing with each other about how we're going to effect $2.4 trillion in savings in order to extend the debt ceiling by $2.4 trillion. And we can't figure out a way to do it. And that should show you what's wrong with our system and why we need to put some accountability in it. Now, I am confident that over the next 48 hours or so, that the White House and legislative leaders are going to find a way to both extend the debt ceiling and to come up with savings that begin to create a down payment on this incredible debt, as well as system reforms that will give not just the markets, but American businesses and families some sense of assurance that we will be able in the future to avoid the problem that some European countries are going through right now. But that will mean that we have to forget about this business of tax increases, which are the worst medicine possible in time of recession, as the President himself noted, find ways to reduce spending that we can agree upon, provide accountability in our government in the future, and in that way assure everyone that we can continue to grow, that growth will produce prosperity and, ironically, more revenues to the Federal Treasury, but more importantly, the standard of living that Americans have become accustomed to and have every right to expect. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Florida.
I ask that, by unanimous consent, that I be recognized to speak for up to 15 minutes.
15. There's 12 and a half minutes left.
12 and a half minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise here on the Senate floor today to speak on the tremendous issue that's captivated, and rightfully so, the attention of our country. Let me start by saying I do not enjoy nor relish the role of partisan attack dog. I never found any fun in that. I don't think it's constructive. I don't intend to become that here in the Senate. I also have only been here for 7 months, which means I haven't been here long enough to think any of the stuff that's going on is normal. And I certainly don't think any of the stuff that goes on around here too often is normal. So I think the fact that I've only been here 7 months has served me well in that regard. Let me begin, if I can, because one of the things I've noticed this week is that Washington is full of, and rightfully so, people from all over the world and all over the country that have traveled here this week to come and watch their government at work and see the monuments of the city, and found themselves in the middle of this debate. So I think it's important to remind people what we're debating, because although it is a difficult and important issue, it is not a complicated one to understand, and it's pretty straightforward. And here's the way I would describe it. The United States of America, more or less, these are rough numbers, but they're accurate, spends about $300 billion a month. It has $180 billion a month that comes to the federal government through taxes and other sources of revenue. And that means that in order to meet its bills at the end of every month, it needs to borrow $120 billion. Now, for much of the history of this country, there have been increases in the debt limit and the ability to borrow money. But what has happened over the last few years is that it's no longer a routine vote, because the people who give us our credit rating are saying too much of the money that you spend every month is borrowed. And we want you to show us how over the next 10 years you are going to borrow less as a percentage of what you spend. And so that's why for years, where the debt limit was a routine vote, it no longer can be. It's not something that was made up in some conservative think tank, but the reality that we cannot continue to borrow 40 to 41% of every penny that the government spends has brought us to this point. So you would think that seeing that, our government and our leaders here in both parties would react to that immediately and work on it. And I've heard a lot of talk today about delaying tactics and delaying votes. I would argue to you that this issue has been delayed at least for the last 2.5 years. In the 2 years before I even came here, neither this chamber neither proposed nor passed a budget. It's a startling figure that for the last 2 years this government has operated without a budget.
Order in chamber, please. Continue.
So think about that. 2 years have gone by without a budget. The first 2 years that the president was the president, no budgets. Some people would say, well, you know, that's because partisanship in Washington. Well, that's not true. In the 2 years before I got here, both the House and the Senate were controlled by members of the Democratic Party, which are the president's party. In fact, in this chamber, for at least one of those 2 years, 60 votes, 60 out of the 100 members here caucused with the Democrats. And as you recall, on Christmas Eve of the year 2009, they were able to pass a health care bill that was very controversial because they had the 60 votes in the president's party. So for 2 years, no budget. In fact, you know how long it's been since this chamber has proposed a budget? Forget passed a budget. Proposed a budget? 822 days. That's a long time. A lot of things have happened in the last 822 days, but proposing a budget is not one of them out of this chamber. So then I got here, and we got here in January. 7 months have passed, still no budget. Again, not budget passed, proposed, offered. Here's our budget, still no budget. 822 days, and every single day that I've been here. Now, in the last 7 days, on this debt debate, we have finally seen a proposal from the esteemed senator from Nevada, the majority leader. You would think, has he brought it to the floor to vote? Not until last night. So, again, offered a proposal over the weekend, and still, for 6 days, we sat around, and what did we do around here? Nothing. It was never brought to a vote. You would think these issues would have been worked on in January, February, March. Nothing. This chamber has done nothing. You talk about delay tactics. They've been delaying for 2.5 years. Now, the President doesn't have the luxury of some of these things. He has to propose a budget by law, and he did. Let me tell you how ridiculous the budget was. Not a single member of this Senate voted for it, including the Democrats. It is a budget that didn't lead with a debt limit. In fact, it increased the debt. That's how absurd the budget was. Where's the President's plan? We haven't seen it. We haven't seen it. Here's the President's plan, a blank sheet of paper. He doesn't have a plan. He hasn't offered a plan. Again, if this was a Republican president, I would say the same thing. I do not understand how an issue of this magnitude, of generational importance, the President of the United States has not offered a plan. If someone has seen the President's plan, please send it to me, because no one else has seen it. It does not exist. So this has been the plan all along, by the way. The plan all along was not to take a position, to let the days count down until we got to this point with 72 hours to go, and then force a vote on something that they wanted. I believe that that has been the plan the entire time. And you can see it carrying itself out. And you want to know why people all across America get grossed out by politics? Is by watching this kind of stuff happen. And instead, let me tell you what we've seen over the last few days. First of all, today, and for much of this time, I've heard all these attacks and name-calling. If we had $1 billion for every time that I hear the word Tea Party extremist, we could solve this debt problem. So all this name-calling. So I said, well, let me read some quotes about this debt limit. And I found some pretty extremist quotes. Here's one. Let me read you what it says. The fact that we are here today to debate raising America's debt limit is a sign of leadership's failure. America has a debt problem and a failure of leadership. Americans deserve better. I, therefore, intend to oppose the effort to increase America's debt limit. A quote from a Tea Party extremist, right? No. This is a quote from March 16th of 2006 from Senator Barack Obama of Illinois. I found another extremist quote. This one says, because this massive accumulation of debt was predicted, because it was foreseeable, because it was unnecessary, because it was the result of willful and reckless disregard for the warnings that were given and for the fundamentals of economic management, I am voting against the debt limit increase. Well, that must be from a Tea Party extremist member of the House, right? No. This is March 16, 2006, from Senator Joe Biden of Delaware. And last but not least is a quote from September 27th of 2007. It says, I find it distasteful and disturbing to increase the debt limit yet again. Clearly, we need to change course, and this debt limit bill is just another reminder of that. And that is from the distinguished senator from Nevada, the majority leader, on that date in 2007. And yet now, these same quotes, in this context, where we're talking about raising the debt limit more than has ever been raised in a one vote, is extremism? This name-calling is absurd, and it sets this process back. The other thing I hear, oh, it's not reasonable, this is a waste of time, this bill can't pass the Senate, when they talk about the House bill. So now what disqualifies a bill is the fact that it can't pass in the Senate. Well, guess what? The Senate bill can't pass in the Senate. The Senate bill can't pass in the Senate.
Would the senator yield for a question?
Yes, I'll yield.
I thank the senator for doing that. That's become somewhat unusual in the Senate today, so I truly appreciate it. I would ask the senator, as ironic as it may be that on occasion people in the past have indeed voted against the debt limit, both Republicans and Democrats alike, is it not true that in those situations, those votes did not hold the nation hostage, did not come at a moment of enormous economic fragility as we are in today, and did not run the risk of default because it was going to pass overwhelmingly every time? Is that not true?
To the senator from Massachusetts, I would say two things. The first is that those votes, put it to you this way, if the senator from Illinois at the time, Senator Obama, had had his way, we would be in the same position we're in right now, because he had voted against the debt. And I recognize the President has now said that the debt limit is he made a mistake and he wouldn't have said that were he here today. My point, I would point to the senator from Massachusetts, is that rhetoric 2 years ago was not considered extremist language, and now that rhetoric, which, by the way, I have not found, I think it is a myth. I think it is a myth. There may be a handful of people in the building, both in the House and Senate perhaps, that believe that the nation doesn't have to raise the debt limit, but by and large everyone recognizes that something must be done about the debt limit. What we have also said, I speak for myself, let me not speak for any other member of this chamber or the next. What I have also said is that it would be a terrible mistake to lose this opportunity to do something meaningful about the debt, and that the debt limit gives us an opportunity to do something meaningful about the debt, because the crisis that America faces is not one that I have defined, but one that has been defined by the rating houses and the rating agencies, who have said that if you do not get your spending in order, we don't care whether you raise your debt limit or not, we will downgrade you. And what that means for every American is an increase in their debt, in their interest payments.
Senator, further you for question.
Yes.
Mr. President, I appreciate what the senator is saying. I'd just say, first of all, that everybody understands the danger of the rating agencies right now. The problem is we've got to reach across the aisle and negotiate. We've got to come to agreement. And right now, there's not a lot of negotiating going on. I would ask the senator if he doesn't agree that there's an enormous difference between, the senator a moment ago said, if he had gotten his way. But the whole point is, everybody knew he wasn't about to get his way. That was a truly symbolic vote. Today, however, is it not true we are on the brink of a default, and the absence of negotiation or the absence of a settlement presents us with a far more serious consequence to the unwillingness to raise the debt ceiling today?
To the senator from Massachusetts, I would say that it is impossible to negotiate with someone who doesn't have a plan. How do you negotiate with someone who will not offer a plan and will not put it on the table? But the finger-pointing of who has a plan and who doesn't have a plan is relevant, but it's not the central issue here. I would also say that in March of this year, March 30th to be exact of this year, I wrote an op-ed piece that ran in the Wall Street Journal, and it outlined the things that I was looking for to be a part of this debate. And I was told on March of this year that we didn't have enough time to do all those things, although later on we found that perhaps we did, this grand bargain. And I am prepared. As I stand here today, if there is a meeting going on right after this, I'd love to be a part of it. I am prepared to discuss the things that I believe we need to do, not just to raise the debt limit. Raising the debt limit is the easiest thing this country faces right now. That's one vote away. The hard thing is to show the world that we are serious about putting our spending in order so that we can show people that we're actually going to be able to pay our bills down the road. And that is a combination of things that I have outlined very clearly, not just on March of this year in the Wall Street Journal, but in repeated speeches on this floor. And those are the things we need to do. Two things. Number one is we need to grow our economy, because while the debt is the biggest issue in Washington, jobs are the biggest issue facing America. And if we could get more people back to work, we would have more people paying taxes. And if we had more people paying taxes, we'd have more revenue for government. And so that's the first thing we need to do, is figure out how we can create jobs in America. And I think there is bipartisan agreement on things we can do to do that. The President himself mentioned regulatory reform as a necessity in the State of the Union. Let's do it. We've all talked about tax reform, flattening and simplifying our tax code. And if there are things in that tax code that do not belong there because they are the process of good lobbying instead of good policy, then let's go after those things. We've talked about that. Let's talk about those. I think we all agree that there has to be some changes in discretionary spending, but we also agree that that doesn't solve the problem. That's a small piece of our overall budget. That we have to save Medicare because it goes bankrupt if we leave it the way it is. That we have to save Medicaid because it goes bankrupt if we leave it the way it is. And I can tell you that history will back up what I'm about to say, and that is that there is no government run by conservatives, Republicans, put whoever you want there. If you give government the opportunity to spend more money than it has, it will do it. It will do it every time. And that's why I believe there are at least 20 members of the Senate and the other party who have supported some version of the balanced budget amendment, and yet it's something we cannot even get a vote on, much less discuss here in the Senate. So I believe there can be compromise on those outlines. But here's the last thing I would say. I believe my time is about to expire, so let me close with this. Compromise is fantastic. I would love nothing more than to leave this building tomorrow night having said the Republic still works. I was able to stand shoulder to shoulder with people from states far from mine, with views different from mine, but who love their country so much that we were able to come together and save it when it faced this catastrophe. I would love nothing more than compromise. But I would say to you that compromise that's not a solution is a waste of time. If my house was on fire I can't compromise about which part of the house I'm going to save. You save the whole house, or it will all burn down. We either save this country or we do not. And to save it, we must seek solutions.
Time.
I yield the floor.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be recognized to speak for up to 15 minutes in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, we've arrived at a moment of truth. The American economy and our standing in the world hangs in balance as a result of a Republican plan to derail the functioning of our country and bring about the precarious prospect of a major default in our financial condition. Democrats have bent over backwards to compromise, and yet the Republicans continue to put our country in jeopardy. And the American people and the American economy are determined for a reprieve from this disaster. And, well, we just heard comments by our colleague from across the aisle about getting our tax structure in order. Reminds me of a condition where there's a fire in a house and people start arguing about the color of the fire engine. What we have here in front of us is an immediate disaster program that could upset the balance of our functioning in our society and put America for the first time in a position of less support from around the world and putting people, working people, hard at work trying to keep ends meet are going to be prevented from doing so. So we ask, isn't this a time for our Republican friends to stop playing gotcha, stop putting politics ahead of the needs of our middle-class families, and instead start putting the people before politics? Make no mistake, the people that we serve are nervous and concerned. Purchasing power has declined while wage increases have been insufficient for family needs. And many in America are working their fingers to the bone to get out of this economic squeeze and keep their families intact. And all this time, while the richest among us see monumental gains in their incomes and their wealth, the people who have the burdens of maintaining our infrastructure, running our military, and defending the very foundation of our democratic country are struggling daily to stay in their homes, hold on to their health care, and get their kids to college. And the American people are the ones, the ordinary people, the middle-income people are the ones who are going to suffer the most if the Republicans force the U.S. government to default next week. 14 million Americans are already out of work, but more than 500,000 may join the unemployment line further if we don't raise the debt limit. And that's just the beginning. A default crisis will send interest rates skyrocketing, which will be adding even more expense on the American middle class and make it harder for them to meet basic family needs. They'll be forced to pay higher interest rates for mortgages, student loans, car loans, and credit cards. And that money won't help create jobs or rebuild our economy. It'll be going to the banks and to China and to investors who are going to demand higher yields for U.S. bond purchases because they are less reliable in their likelihood of being paid back. We're also likely to see another calamity on Wall Street if the United States doesn't pay its bills. The stock markets have already been seeing daily declines in anticipation of a reckless attempt to put politics in the middle of financial Armageddon. One analysis found that shareholders in U.S. stocks lost more than $400 billion during the past week, while House Republicans were fiddling with a scheme they knew never would become law, but they don't want to write law. They want to destroy the Obama presidency. That's what the mission is. The Dow has just had its worst week in a year, and consumers do not have spare dollars for investments because their incomes are consumed by spending money on basic necessities and because they're wary of losses that will occur from the prospect of default. Mr. President, imagine what it will mean to the 401k savings of middle-class Americans, much of it accumulated over years. If faith in our country and its value decline sharply as defaults loom ahead, their values can go down precipitously. Our retirement savings can also be, other retirement savings can also be wiped out, all because of these punitive actions by their Republican representatives. The pain will be excruciating for the neediest Americans. Seniors living on a fixed income could be forced to go without their Social Security checks and the critical health care they receive through Medicare. And we might not be able to deliver promised benefits to veterans or paychecks for the men and women wearing our country's uniform in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I want to be clear. A default will injure America's reputation throughout the world. It will weaken faith in the world's most respected financial power, leaving our country's credibility, stability, and financial leadership in doubt. Simply put, defaulting on the debt could trigger an economic collapse of historic proportion. And that's why I plead with our Republican colleagues, join us without delay in adopting Majority Leader Reid's plan. Senator Reid's plan will provide certainty for middle-class Americans and to the markets because it will provide stability. That's what we need right now through 2013. Mr. President, this plan isn't perfect. In fact, including me, believe it should include revenues. It doesn't, but that's why it's called a compromise. And after we adopt this plan and step back from the brink, we need to work on a balanced approach to get our country back on sound economic footing. And it means asking the wealthiest among us to pay their fair share. I was one of those who was very fortunate in my business experience. I started a company with two other fellows, and we have 45,000 employees today. Why? It was because our country was there for me after I served in uniform in World War II. I was able to get an education at Columbia University, and we started the company called ADP. 45,000 people have their jobs because of ADP. And it means our Republican colleagues have to abandon their obsession to protect the wealthiest among us at an unaffordable cost to the poor and the middle class. It means recognizing the value of our country's human infrastructure. No economy can grow if you don't invest in physical infrastructure like roads, bridges, railways, and no society can prosper if you don't invest in education, propping up our human infrastructure to enable Americans to fill the future jobs in technology and science and research. Let's face it, buildings, houses, other physical facilities are never built from the top down. The work requires a strong foundation to guarantee reliability, endurance, and safety now and for the future. Middle-class families form America's foundation. The pillars of strength, faith in the future, belief that Americans can survive challenges and catastrophes, and further belief that no place on earth exists with more freedom and liberty than our blessed country. But all that could evaporate if default is permitted to come. And over the past half-century, the debt ceiling has been raised 75 times, almost two-thirds of them under Republican presidents. In fact, the debt ceiling was increased 18 times under President Reagan and 7 times under President George W. Bush. Our country has never defaulted on its obligations, and default must be prevented if we love our country. It's time for the Republicans to abandon their my way or the highway approach. It's time for the Republicans to stop playing politics with our country's economy. The time for politics is Election Day 2012, not now. Let's do our work, keep our precious ship steady afloat. Majority Leader Reid's plan is our best hope to avoid a disaster, and we need to act on it without further delay. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. I yield back any balance of time and note the absence.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, if there is one thing in this long, difficult debate that there is no question about, one thing that all of us have long known, one simple truth that we must get past if we're going to avoid default, it's that any bill to get us out of this crisis will need Democratic and Republican votes. There is no partisan solution, no other path, no magic trick at the 11th hour. There is just compromise. After all the bluster and back and forth and posturing, there is just the bill that we have before us today. It's a bill that doesn't have everything that all of us want. It's not the bill that any one of us would have crafted if we had our way. But it is a bill that can and should be passed to avoid an economic catastrophe that would leave families in every single one of our states reeling. Now, Mr. President, I understand that compromise has been hard to come by in these negotiations, no matter how hard we try. But with Senator Reid's bill, we have taken the Republicans at their word. We have come to the negotiating table and have put forward a plan that goes to great pains to meet every one of the criteria they have called for. They said they wanted cuts that exceed the debt limit raise. This bill delivers that. They said they wanted no new tax revenues. This bill delivers that. They said they wanted to put in place a process to make even more cuts later. This bill delivers that. And they have said they, too, want to avoid default. And this bill is our way out. Mr. President, I know my Republican colleagues don't want to see us default. I know that while we don't see eye to eye on all issues, we all fight for the people of our states. And I also know my Republican friends are hearing the same things from families in their home states I'm hearing from mine. I know their offices have been flooded with calls and emails from families trying to figure out what they'd do if the support they depend on to stay in their homes or put food on their table is suddenly cut off. I know they're hearing from the same seniors and veterans and college students with the same message. Put America first. Get it done. Compromise. Mr. President, I got a letter just like that from Ann Phillips from Tacoma, Washington, who after 18 years working was laid off during the recession. Ann told me about how she felt she was doing the responsible thing by getting up and dusting herself off and going back to college. But now she said she's worried sick because of the fact that the interest rates on her student loans, which she relies on to pay for her school, would shoot up if we defaulted. In her letter, Ann made clear who the real victims of this default would be. She said, and I quote, "Ultimately, people like me, my husband, my family, and all the people I know who are doing their best every day to make a contribution to society, they will pay the expense." I also heard from a woman named Brenda Starkey and her husband, retired Navy veterans from Republic, Washington. They told me if we don't meet this challenge, they may not be able to afford Medicare payments or VA medical co-payments, not to mention basic necessities like food or electricity or water. Brenda wrote, and I quote, "I was taught in school about Henry Clay and his great compromise. I still believe this is the way our government is supposed to work, with both sides giving some ground until a common position is met. We deserve more from our government." I also heard from Social Security recipients like Alyssa Terry from Bellingham, Washington, who told me how important that monthly check is to her and just what it would mean if it didn't go out this month. And she said simply, quote, "Social Security is my lifeline. It stands between me and homelessness." Mr. President, this isn't just about politics. It's about these people and millions more who may not even realize their well-being is on the line today. It's about the average American families whose credit card interest rates would skyrocket. It's about homeowners whose mortgage payments will increase by over $1,000 a year. It's about rising food and utility and gas prices and what that would mean for our already cash-strapped families. And it's about retirement plans that would plummet. These Americans are looking for real leadership and a real solution to this problem. They don't want more games or gimmicks or short-term patches. And, Mr. President, for anyone who believes a short-term extension is a good idea, I just want everyone to envision just what that would mean. Imagine we are right back here, right here, on the brink, doing the same thing in 5 short months. Only now we are 5 or 6 months closer to an election, and the battle lines are drawn deeper than they are today. And we are also smack in the middle of one of the most important economic times of the whole year for retailers and consumers, the holiday season. Just imagine the effect of this crisis and this standstill would feel like then. Imagine holiday shoppers worried that their credit card interest rates are going to shoot up, or that next month's mortgage payment is going to break the bank. Or retailers reluctant to stock their shelves or hire because they're worried about a major disruption in the economy. Or seniors on Social Security worried their check won't be mailed and their heating bill will go up. Not to mention veterans or college students or our troop sons again, who would once again be put in the spiral of anxiety and insecurity right at the holiday times. They don't want to relive this. America doesn't want to go through this again, and they shouldn't have to. Nobody should. And that is why, exactly, we need to come together now. And, Mr. President, as I said before, the bill in front of us this evening is not ideal, but it gets us to where we need to get to today to protect our families and small businesses across America from market uncertainty and the threat of default. This legislation does make deep and serious cuts to government spending. It does protect Medicare and Social Security benefits that we promised to our seniors, and it puts the country on a more sustainable fiscal track and allows us to continue working to reduce the debt and deficit without the threat of economic calamity hanging over our heads again. Mr. President, Democrats have compromised, and compromised again and again. And this bill that is before us now is the fruit of those compromises. It's also the last and best hope of preventing us from defaulting in a few short days on the full faith and credit of our nation for the first time in our history. There's no other choice. The markets are waiting and watching. Credit rating agencies are waiting and watching. Countries around the world are waiting and watching. But most importantly, Mr. President, the American people are waiting and watching. I hope we pass this bill. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator Morgan.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I rise to address this issue of the debt limit and how we are going to go forward. And I think it's important, given the conversation that I've been hearing this morning, to understand some of the key features that are under discussion. The first is that the plan that came from the House last night, the Boehner plan, it requires the second half of the debt ceiling to be lifted only if a balanced budget amendment is passed and sent out to the states. In other words, it puts a two-thirds vote of each chamber basically on the process 6 months from now. What that does is it says to our nation that we are going to be in continuous debate over this issue the next 6 months, facing a two-thirds vote that's very unlikely to happen. So this crisis is going to not end, not on August 2nd, not on August 3rd, not on August 4th, but not for 6 months into the future, and then it's not going to end because we aren't going to have a two-thirds vote. It sends exactly the wrong message to our business community, which is waiting for a sense of stability, that we are through this moment. It sends the wrong message to the international world that is looking at the question of whether they're going to buy Treasury bills. It sends the wrong message to in regards to our reputation in the world. This plan of continuing the crisis for 6 months in order to bring this nation to its knees, just so folks campaign on the fact that they will do better, if you will, does not represent the best of the American spirit, where we should be coming together to solve problems, not to extend problems, not to amplify problems, not to hurt families across the United States of America and hurt small businesses across this land. The second thing that the proposal did that we faced last night is it took defense spending off the table for 2 years. Now, why is this important? It's important because defense spending has grown by over 300% in the last decade, over 300%. It's important because the recent Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, said there are over $100 billion of defense programs that do not contribute to our national security. We must be looking at programs that do not contribute for their intended purpose if we are going to take and address our fiscal situation with the best possible path for America. And then the Speaker said, you know what, there's going to be a super committee, but I, the Speaker, am only going to allow it to consider cuts to direct spending. And I will not appoint anyone who would look at the full range of options, that is, to include programs tucked into the tax code. Now, it was just a few minutes ago, my colleague from Florida, he said, if there are tax programs which are there not because of good policy, but because of good lobbying, those need to be on the table. He is absolutely right. It is a situation where every citizen understands that whether you spend $10,000 on a grant or $10,000 on a tax credit, it is the same $10,000. Now, there is a reason. There is a reason that the Boehner plan has put tax loopholes and tax earmarks and tax programs off the table. And that is because inserted into the tax code are programs for the wealthy and the well-connected. And why do they want their programs in the tax code? Very simply. They avoid the annual authorization process. They avoid the annual appropriation process. And you can think of them as super programs because they don't get reviewed regularly. That's where the well-connected and the wealthy want to have their programs placed. And they've been very successful in that. It has been over a quarter century since we have had a systematic review of these programs. But here we are in a fiscal crisis. It makes sense to examine the tax loopholes, many of which have outlived their usefulness, they've outlived their use, and many others which may still be very valid. And those are the ones we should keep, but we need to examine all of them. Now, I had a colleague come to the floor the other day, a colleague across the aisle, and he made this argument. He said, you know, there are some tax programs that benefit the middle class. And he proceeded to put up all these charts and all these numbers about programs that benefit the middle class. And he concluded that because some of the tax programs benefit the middle class, no tax programs should be discussed as part of this issue. Well, let's apply the same logic to our appropriation programs. Can't anyone say that there are some spending programs, some direct spending programs that benefit the middle class? But then do we turn around and say all of these programs should be left unexamined as a result? Of course not. Nor was my colleague across the aisle willing to make that argument. But why did he make such an absurd argument? That because some programs are useful, we shouldn't look at any of the programs in the tax code? Because he wanted to protect the programs for the wealthy and well-connected. And I'll tell you today, there's something terribly wrong with coming to this floor to protect the programs for the best off in our society and doing so under the false claim that you're here to fight for working families. That is wrong. And that is why we must look at every single program. There's another problem in the bill that we had, and that is if you take Boehner at his word and he's going to take the $1.5 trillion that are in the tax code under tax expenditures and not allow them to be examined, then the only place you end up going to reach the numbers involved are Medicaid and Medicare. Medicaid, health care for the poor. Medicare, health care for our seniors. It seems that there are members of this chamber who want to think of health care as a special privilege for only those who are wealthy in our society. Well, maybe they should come and live in my community, where we understand that the quality of life is deeply dependent upon your health. There was indeed a very interesting experiment in Oregon over the last few years. We had funds, not enough funds for everyone to participate in Medicaid. It's called the Oregon Health Plan. And so there was a lottery. So for the first time anywhere in the nation, there was the ability to study those who got to sign up against a control group of those who didn't. Found out that Medicaid made a profound difference in people's lives. It shouldn't come as any surprise that health care makes a profound difference. But many people on this floor have questioned whether health care really matters. It's always interesting to hear people who have access to health care, who have it because they're wealthy, who have it because they have a job right here that gives them health care, wondering why we should bother to care about health care for others. These issues are issues we must address as we go forward. Now, let me just check in here on my time. 2.5 minutes. Let me note then that if we proceed with a plan that is guaranteed to paralyze this chamber over the next 6 months with an impossible hurdle at the end of that period, we will destroy this economy. We are flat right now. We're not gaining ground. We had a bill, small business innovation bill, research bill here on the floor, debated it for 6 weeks, routine bill. My colleagues across the aisle voted not to end debate so that there couldn't be a vote on taking this bill forward. Deeply determined to prevent bills creating jobs from getting to the President's desk. Well, indeed, because we haven't been able to take those key pieces of legislation and go forward, here we are with a flat economy. And now they want to take it to its knees. Because if we create this uncertainty over the next 6 months, the interest rate goes up on the Treasury bills. The interest rate goes up on home mortgages. The interest rate goes up on car loans. The interest rate goes up on small businesses. And we get greater unemployment. And is that the outcome we want? Interest is an empty tax. A tax on every family, they estimate it to be about $2,000 a year, and it buys us nothing. Nothing but destruction of the economy. And that must not happen. Right. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Wyoming.
Mr. President, I appreciate the comments of the person that preceded me. We are heading into a territory where we've never been before. And in Washington, you get to get your Sunday funnies on Saturday. And so I took a little peek at Dilbert today, and I hope everybody will look at that because it emphasizes the problem. Dilbert says, I'm preparing for the complete meltdown of our financial system. I've got 6 months of food and water. I've got batteries and flashlights and gold coins. And the lady with the triangular hair says, I'm prepared too. I have your home address. And I noticed that your preparations are light on defensive weaponry. Then she says, could you add some protein bars to the shopping list? And I want to share with you a letter from a 10-year-old in Wyoming that made our statewide newspaper. He says, what does the government think of me? I think they think I'm not smart because I'm too young to know what they're doing, like raising the national debt. Don't they know I owe the country about $45,000? I'm only 10 years old. I could buy a lot with $45,000. That's more than my dad earns. But it wouldn't buy everything. Government shouldn't try to buy everything. It is my job and the people's job to buy things we need. I don't want the government to think for me. They don't know I'm a little brother who doesn't like it when my big brothers tell me what to do, because they aren't always responsible for their own things. I don't tell my brothers what to do with their money. I'm smarter than they think I am. They should follow the rules. I'd ask that the entire letter be printed at the completion of my speech, and I thank Eric Mitchell of Crowheart, Wyoming, for his sage advice. It is disappointing to be here today, addressing the United States Senate on a topic that we should have dealt with months ago. Our country is in a financial crisis. Erskine Bowles, the co-chairman of the Deficit Commission, coined the situation we face as, quote, the most predictable economic crisis in history, end quote. And yet, there is no clear path forward to deal with both the short-term need to raise the debt limit and the long-term need to get spending under control. I'm disappointed we have made this discussion about the debt ceiling instead of our ever-increasing spending. When you spend beyond your means, you have to cut back. That's what the 10-year-old said. The plans we are considering at this stage in the debate are plans for the next 2 years. While there is merit making the spending cuts these bills make, they are not the ultimate solution. We need more significant action. We need to move forward with something bold. My Republican colleagues and I have proposed such plans. I have proposed a solution that would cut just 1 penny from every dollar we spend for 6 years and then cap the spending at the historical amount of revenue that we take in during the 7th year. In the 8th year, we would have a balanced budget. Unfortunately, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to even debate measures like my penny plan or the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act, or even the plan put forward by Speaker Boehner. At the same time they refuse to debate these measures, they refuse to put forward their own plan for long-term structural changes. They're only willing to debate plans that make changes in the short term, and so we're stuck here on a weekend debating a plan that's deeply flawed. I think it's important to look at where the debate is today versus where it was when President Obama was sworn in. It's clear that we've come a long way from where we were when President Obama took office. In 2009, Democrats in Congress passed a so-called economic stimulus bill that cost $1 trillion. To pay for it, we borrowed that money. And as the unemployment numbers prove, all that borrowing didn't solve our economic problems. Apparently, we spent over $275,000 per job, and none of those employees got paid that well. In 2010, President Obama's second year in office, Democrats in Congress forced through an unpopular health care bill which was wrought with budget gimmicks and will ultimately cost our country trillions of dollars. The President's attempt at health care reform was so unsuccessful that the largest problem facing our debt and deficit situation is what we will do to contain health care costs. Another $1 trillion borrowed, another $1 trillion wasted. The American people were fed up with congressional Democrats' reckless spending spree, and in November 2010, they voted for real change. Those votes ushered in a new attitude, and 7 months into a Republican-controlled House of Representatives, the debate is entirely different. Instead of looking at where we can spend money, we're looking for where we can cut. Instead of looking at how to borrow more money, we're looking at how we can change our spending habits so that we have a spending plan that will work in the future. Republicans have heard the people's call for smaller government and less spending and are committed to taking action. Either this year, Earlier this year, Republicans led efforts to cut spending and appropriations bills for the first time in years. Now we need to find a solution to cut trillions of dollars in spending at the same time that we allow the President to have some additional borrowing authority to pay for the purchases we've already made. The cuts Republicans have proposed are the largest cuts ever seen, but it still isn't enough to fix the problem long term. Why aren't we looking at a long-term solution to this problem? Why are we forced to look at short-term piddly spending cuts at the same time we give the President the ability to borrow lots more money? This isn't one person or one party's fault. The President does have us in a box. During his State of the Union message, the President could have explained to the American people the dire situation we're facing. The Deficit Commission had already painted the picture. The President needed to premiere that picture. He could have explained that we're borrowing more than 40 cents of every dollar that we spend, much of it from China. He could have explained that we are on a spending spree that must be stopped. That was and is the true State of the Union. After the State of the Union, he could have sent us a serious budget modeled after his own Deficit Commission. Instead, he used the State of the Union to talk about more spending, and his budget was a ridiculous proposal, so ridiculous it didn't receive a single vote, Republican or Democratic, when it was put before the Senate. Let me repeat that. His State of the Union about spending and his budget was such a ridiculous proposal it didn't receive a single vote, not a Republican vote or a Democratic vote, when it was put before the Senate. While the Senate has failed to lead and deserves a substantial portion of the blame, we in Congress have also put ourselves in this box. During the last administration, we should have worked to contain spending. While we missed that opportunity, when it was clear that we needed to make a major change this year, Democrats in the Senate should have ignored the President's lack of leadership and put forth a budget proposal in the Senate. The House passed a budget, but rather than taking their proposal seriously, my Democratic colleagues demonized the plan as the end of Medicare. They preferred finding a campaign issue as opposed to actually solving the financial problems we face. Unfortunately, we're quickly running out of options. We are at a catch-22. The country can't afford more debt, but has to have it. If we don't raise the debt ceiling, we won't be able to pay all our bills, and the interest rates will go up. On the other hand, if we pass a plan that doesn't fundamentally change the way we do business in Washington, we increase the debt limit with no end in sight, and interest rates go up. The majority in the Senate that brought you banking reform has run up a huge debt, and we've all maxed out the nation's credit cards. Now they want to increase the amount of the mortgage. Imagine trying to get a loan when nothing has been paid on the principal of the previous loan for years. Now imagine the lender's reaction when he's told that the mortgagee will be back shortly for another loan. Let me put this in concrete terms because it might be easier to understand. Trying to keep these numbers proportional to the $14 trillion debt. Imagine that you have a loan on a very large house with a mortgage of $1.4 million. Since buying the house, you have made interest payments, but not a single payment on the principal. You determine you need more money to spend, so you go to the lender and you request an additional loan of $230,000. At the same time you do that, you are honest and warn the lender that you'll be back next year and for the next 9 years asking for $100,000 more each year. You also let the lender know that you don't want to have to pay off any of the principal on the loan, just make interest payments each year. I don't think any lender would take you seriously, but if he or she did, they would explain that you would have to obtain a variable rate loan. A variable rate loan means that the changes in risk to the economy could drive interest rates much higher, and there'd be no protection from these higher interest rates. In other words, your loan with an excellent interest rate of 2.5% could go to an interest rate of 5% or 10%, or like under President Carter, over 18% a year. A 1% increase in the interest rate for the U.S. debt would cost another $1.3 trillion over 10 years. That's just a 1% raise. The lender would point out that the raise in debt plus the rise in interest rates could result in your entire paycheck going to interest. and the interest payments would have to come ahead of food, clothing, and any social needs for you or your children or your parents or your grandparents. That's what we're talking about here as a potential future for the United States. The entire interest payments going to be the only thing that we can pay for. Now, if the banker were foolish enough to consider such a loan, he'd want to know what spending changes you were going to make. He would expect changes immediately, not piddly changes this year for a promise of a big change in the 9th year. He would want some proof that you're serious. If we act now and agree to cut 1%, the 1% solution, just 1 penny of each dollar from our spending and reduce the cap to the new spending level by that year for each of the next 7 years, the lender might consider your loan serious. There's a good chance he would expect 2 or 3% in cuts for the first year to demonstrate you're serious about kicking your spending habit. We are in that situation today in Congress. The President is asking for a $2 4/10 trillion loan increase, the largest loan increase in our nation's history. Our lenders will explain to us, if we were worried about the low income, the downtrodden, and the less fortunate today, we should see what will happen to those individuals if we don't cut spending. If we reach a situation where all our revenues are going to interest payments on the debt, the future prioritization to pay for our debt will be unbearable. We can't go out 18 months. The American people don't trust us. We need to be accountable to the people. We need an enforceable, accountable plan with quicker results. Some might argue that the lender would just expect you to bring in more money. Well, my Democratic colleagues suggest just that when they say we must raise taxes. But everyone knows that if you ask your boss for a raise because you can't control your spending, you could be fired or demoted, and as a result you would bring in less revenue. I don't need to tell you that our bosses, the American people, don't think much of how we've been working for them, and they don't expect a tax increase every time Washington gets addicted to giving away money. The plan the majority leader has offered uses budget gimmicks to avoid real spending cuts and gives the President a debt limit increase that, while politically expedient, fails to put our country on a workable path. It doesn't provide a way to assure any substantial cuts will be made. While it maybe makes some necessary spending cuts today, it does not provide us with relief from our long-term challenges and does not put us in a situation where we would be forced to make tough choices. We know that the majority leader's proposal won't pass. Every Republican has made clear that they will oppose the proposal, and so it doesn't have a chance to move forward. We have made clear that we will not give the President the largest single debt ceiling increase in history for double the average time generally allowed since 1940 through the proposal the majority leader has offered. We've offered to vote on this proposal time and time again, and for reasons beyond comprehension, he refuses to allow a vote. He did a vote within 30 minutes of the time that the House bill came over here, but he wants to drag out the vote on his bill. I know that that's delay to bring the pressure to the last minute, but that isn't how reasonable government works. I wish we had taken action earlier to avoid the situation we find ourselves in today. I wish the proposal before us was a serious effort to make structural change to how we spend money. Instead, we all know the plan put forward by the majority leader will be voted down later tonight or tomorrow and will be in the same place we are right now, in the box where we need to raise the debt limit, but we also need to make structural changes to get our fiscal house in order to keep the markets from melting down. We do recognize we're about to enter territory where our country has never been. The stock markets are already reacting. Because we are debating short-term solutions, this debate will continue on even after we act on the debt ceiling. I hope we can come together on a debt ceiling increase and a plan for real spending cuts. That's where the emphasis needs to be, and it has to have enforcement. I hope the debt ceiling is limited to the amount of guaranteed cuts. I hope we can put our country back on a sustainable fiscal path. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,